let's start with prayer, shall we? Heavenly Father, we thank you for your Son and for your Spirit. We pray that you would pour out your Spirit on us today as we read your word and as we talk about it. We ask that we would have your life breathed into us by the encounter with your Spirit.
Sorry?
In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, so last week, if I remember, we were talking about the ways that the Acts 2 passage are referenced elsewhere in Scripture, right? So we talked about the theophanies, the revelation of God, with the wind and the fire and the noise from heaven. And we also talked about Tower of Babel and the connections there with languages, with the response to what God did of confusion and amazement. And then we were talking a little bit about the countries that are listed in Acts 2. And that's where we had stopped. But first, any questions? Anything you came across this week? So I have, in my exegesis class, I had a friend who made charts for everything. We called him Chart Boy. We're very original here. I got some more than that. Sorry, anyway, so then I found when I was writing my paper, I thought, I don't know, I made a handful of charts in my exegesis paper. So these are from my exegesis papers, so they will need a little bit of explanation, I think. So there are a lot of theories about this list of nations that's in Acts 2. And so here I made a little table that has them, and we'll kind of talk through them.
For Brian, I'm sorry, excuse me.
He's probably hospitality rooms where their class is.
I'm sorry, thank you.
No problem. And so we'll just kind of look through this, and the purpose of doing this is twofold. One, because I think it's kind of interesting. Two, though, I think it's helpful to be familiar with what scholarship is doing. And I don't know if many of you take time to read commentaries or articles on these things. I would guess not. Maybe you do in Bible studies that you're in and things like that. But I kind of think it's interesting. The dialogue is interesting. And I think it's helpful for us because sometimes we make assumptions about the way things ought to be read, but actually there's a lot more dialogue really going on. That we're not really sure about a lot of things, and so I think it's helpful to sort of get multiple perspectives. I mean, that's my own, I don't know if that's helpful for everybody, but anyway. So we'll look through these. Some of these are crazy, some of them are really helpful. We'll start with the crazy one first at the very bottom. Astrological geography. What? Totally insane. In the 4th century CE, or AD, there were lists of geographical areas grouped under the 12 signs of the zodiac for astrological purposes. Paulus, so from the 4th century, this is the con. These are the lists we're talking about. It's really a crazy idea because there's no indication that Luke would have had any idea about these when he was making his list. So it's actually totally insane. But it's out there, and so I thought it would be worth, in my table, it makes my table look more complete. But Brinkman, the key supporter, that guy, he wrote an article from like the 1960s, and I could find nothing else to support this. So it's probably not what this is. So other things we have here are more to the point. And actually, I'm starting at the bottom. We'll just work our way up. The biblical prophecies. The eschatological ingathering of the Jews from the diaspora. How about that for a sentence? The diaspora, we talked a little bit last week. Does anybody remember what that is?
The Jews were spread out.
Right. So through just centuries of capture, of conquering nations coming in and taking people out and scattering the people. They had wound up all over the place. So when we read Acts 2 and it talks about Jews speaking all of these languages, that's completely, it makes sense. So eschatological, anybody who's in the what class? What is eschatological? End times, right? So this is the ultimate ingathering of the people who were dispersed. And that's what that sentence means. And the specifically Isaiah is mentioned here under the sources. Isaiah 11 and 66 talk about that, right? This is a picture we have of everyone, of the Jews specifically, because this is Isaiah being gathered back into the kingdom of heaven, being brought back into the fold, into the holy city. And so maybe this is what's happening with this list of nations. Luke has included nations that are all over the known world. Maybe he's saying, he's talking about this ingathering. So the pros, the diaspora Jews now living in Jerusalem, so that's true, there are Jews from all these nations in Jerusalem, and belief that Jerusalem would be the eschatological home, the ultimate home, the kingdom of heaven. And that's the pros for that. And the cons, though, that none of these prophecies have lists of countries. And Acts 2 does not talk about the end time implications. Acts 2 is not actually talking about an ingathering at all, right? It's talking about sending people out. So you have kind of cross purposes there, and that's, I think, probably a pretty good argument for why that's not maybe the case. Because in Isaiah, the Jews are being gathered home. But in Acts, people are hearing the gospel, they're hearing the good news, and then they're being sent out. Go back home, go back to your people, and share the good news of who Jesus is and what he has done. And so they're really kind of opposite. Okay, so moving up the list here, we have Genesis 10. The list in Acts 2 alludes to a table of nations in Genesis 10. That's sort of the idea, because we've got Babel, and we've got Pentecost, and there are those comparisons that we were talking about last week. And and part of the Acts 2 story is this list of nations, and immediately preceding the Tower of Babel is a list of nations. There's a connection with Noah, and I don't know if I stressed that very much, but Pentecost, the holiday of Pentecost, had been associated with the promises to the patriarchs, but also the promise, the covenant that God had made with Noah. Over time, the Festival of Weeks, or Pentecost, had become associated with the covenant with Abraham, but also the covenant with Noah. And so the list of nations in Genesis 10 is Noah's descendants. And so there's that connection too. Parallel linguistic miracles. So we've got the confusion of languages and then the speaking in tongues. And then the possible parallel with Noah. Those are the pros. The cons, though, the places are very different. The places that are mentioned in Genesis 10 are not the places that are mentioned in Acts 2. So that's sort of the problem with that comparison. And then political propaganda, moving up the list here. The list is a reworking and reversal of Roman political propaganda which claims to rule the entire world. Acts list is showing that Jesus is in fact Lord of all. So Rome, at this point in the first century, right, Rome is conquering everything. They're spreading out their, have been now for a couple hundred years, are taking over the known world, solidifying their authority and their power. They're putting their puppet governments in place in key places, and they would have lists, right? Rome is in charge of the known world, and there would be lists of the countries that Rome has conquered, or the countries that are, I cannot think of the name, states that are, gone. It's totally gone. But they're in allegiance with, or have sworn allegiance to Rome. Rome hasn't actually conquered them, but they're in tow, right? They're part of the empire. And so maybe this is Luke saying Rome thinks that they're in charge of everything, but in fact, they're not. In fact, they only have. In fact, Jesus is in charge. And he reverses the order in Acts 2 too. Let's see, in Acts 2 as well, I should say. Parthians, this is in verse 9. Parthians, Medes, and Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea, and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt, and all parts of Libya near Cyrene, visitors from Rome, both Jews and converts to Judaism, Cretians and Arabs or Arabians. So Rome is at the bottom of the list, right? It's all these other places that are mentioned before, and Rome, by the way, that's there too. So there's sort of a flipping of the power model that Luke is maybe doing, and that's the argument. Political reading is logical with the list of nations, because we're talking about nation states, right? So there is a political dimension there. Not nation states, nations. Restoration of Israel is not a primary concern in Acts. And that doesn't seem to be, and that goes with this list, right? We're not talking about Israel taking over all these places. We're just talking about the places. And then the Spirit's arrival and universal goals. So this goal of God's supremacy being, and Jesus as Lord of all being proclaimed to all of the nations. Those are sort of the pros. Acts, here are the cons. Acts 2 is directed towards a Jewish audience, not a Roman audience. Acts is seen as apologetic, so Acts is actually describing, it's making an explanation, an argument for what the Spirit is doing. For Romans, for the benefit of Romans. So Luke is not usually antagonistic towards Rome. He's not going out of his way to make enemies, right? He ultimately wants Rome to know Christ. So he's not trying to egg them on, right? But it is an interesting idea, isn't it? And the idea that specifically the statement that Jesus is Lord of all. So this list of nations is giving Jesus glory and is reaffirming that God's supremacy. And then at the top of the list, which I put at the top because it's the argument I think is my favorite. I think it's one of the better argued, at least in the research that I did. And that's the diaspora. So we get back to this idea that the Jews were scattered and that this list is representing specifically those who were scattered.
And it reaffirms the idea that Jesus came at just the right time. Mm-hmm. Because it made travel in this area and all of the Roman Empire much easier than it would have been. There would have been little wars here and there and everywhere.
Yeah, it was much easier to travel after the Roman roads, those famous Roman roads were put in.
They still exist.
They still exist. They're that good.
Yeah.
And absolutely and Rome made it relatively safe to travel in these parts. Relatively safe, right?
Yeah.
Still problems, but yeah, absolutely. Jesus came at exactly the right time. And the Holy Spirit was given at exactly the right time. At the Festival of Weeks at Pentecost, the Jews are gathered back into Jerusalem for the festival. So here's the description. Luke's list describes the dispersion of the Jews throughout the world along the lines of the diaspora. Now this, I think, is really interesting. Let's see where I have my list here. Okay, so Luke's list seems to move in the order that the exiles were taken away. So Parthia, Media, Elam, and Mesopotamia were the lands of the earliest dispersion. That is Assyria. Those were the lands that were, back in the day, Assyria, which was the first dispersion. Assyria came in and conquered the northern tribe of Israel. And then you move along. I don't have it all listed out here. I thought I did. To cover Babylon, and then all the way up to like the Persians. So it sort of is covering the areas, and then the Greeks. The Egyptians were, they kept coming back and forth there. But the list seems to kind of go in the order that the Jews were conquered by the nations surrounding them. And so that's kind of a really strong argument for why that's maybe the idea that Luke had in mind when he wrote the list. It's also similar to descriptions by Philo and Josephus. Philo and Josephus. My New Testament professor joked that it'd be a good name for a band, so every time I hear Philo and Josephus, that's what I think of. But Philo and Josephus are Jewish historians from the first and second century AD. And they are huge for scholarship because they are they're documenting things that the church is interested in knowing about. And because they're Jewish, they have a different perspective than the Romans, who are also obviously documenting things that were happening at the time. So they have lists, and Luke's list is similar to lists that Philo and Josephus had come up with. Actually, I don't have their dates right. I think they're earlier. And the lists move from east to west. They have several places in common. There's similar patterns, both end with mainlands and islands. They move to the islands towards the end. So you've got these similarities between these lists of the historians, lists of and the historians are documenting the dispersal of the Jewish people. The con is that Luke's list skips places that have large Jewish populations. He didn't mention Greece, for example. I did when I was telling you about it, but he doesn't. And that's kind of, so it's not exactly the same. So we're not.
What are Phrygia and
Phrygia and Pamphylia is over here. Yeah. So all of this is to say that when you delve deeply into some of these questions and thoughts, like there aren't really obvious answers all the time. And then there is sort of the scholarship idea around it, but then there are the conclusions that we draw, right, as Christians. So what are we to take away from this list that's represented?
You know what's interesting? Is that it's sort of a microcosm of the church.
Yes.
And there's an ingathering for an outgoing.
Right.
And so the local church, we ingather on Sunday so that we spread out during the week.
And we edify and we equip and then are dispersed.
Exactly, and the Church Universal, the same thing. There are times when there's an ingathering in order for a better dispersal.
Yes, that's absolutely, a beautiful thing we can take away from this list. I think this is probably one of the driest parts of this passage, right? It's just this list of countries. But it's exciting too, and so and that's why we're looking at it.
There's so many, you hear this thing, the most segregated place in America on Sunday morning is the local church. But that's because we usually go to church near where we live.
Sure.
But when you have an ingathering of Christians, what strikes you is the multiplicity of languages that the whole world virtually is represented.
Right, the incredible diversity.
Incredible diversity, and sometimes within the local church.
Any other thoughts, things that we can take away from this?
Didn't Jesus make a statement that you will be my witnesses in Judea and Samaria and to the uttermost parts?
Mm-hmm.
So that may have been,
Exactly. There's an echo there.
Real life, yes, and it's really happening.
Right. So Jesus is saying, "You're my witnesses here in Judea and Samaria, which is was the northern kingdom, and to the ends of the earth." Right. So you're going to start here, but you're going to go, and you're going to go far. Absolutely, there's an echo here. Luke is saying, Jesus is so good, he gave us this instruction, and then he made it easy for us because they were already there in Jerusalem, so we could share the gospel and get the gospel gets a head start, right? So the apostles are still going to go out, but so then would all of these people that had been in Jerusalem. And so when the apostles are showing up in Pamphylia, somebody's already heard the good news, and they're there to confirm it and to teach more and to help the church develop roots.
I put a plug in here for prison.
Yes.
And for international students
Yes.
to get involved with these international students, thousands. And these are bright, brilliant people from all over the world. And many of them come to Christ during their time here in Pittsburgh.
That's a
And,
lovely.
it's a
lovely plug.
tremendous opportunity.
So PRISM, which is always funny because you have to enunciate the M.
Yes.
PRISM, the Pittsburgh Regional International Student Ministry, is out of Belfield Church down in Oakland, across the street from the Pitt campus, and they have an incredible ministry to international students. And what Marty's talking about is it is an ingathering, right? People, the best and the brightest from various countries are coming to the United States to study. And it is people who, most of them have advanced degrees already, right? They are not...
Last night, we were at the games, potluck evening, and so we played games and talked with people from China, obviously, from India, from Saudi Arabia, from Turkey, from Croatia, from the Czech Republic, from Latin America, Colombia, all over, many others.
So that is an opportunity that we have in this area to meet with people who are gathered from all over the world, and they do. They're mostly a lot of the international students are interested in working on their English, and then they're interested in a free meal and some hospitality. Anybody who's traveled knows that we as Americans are pretty poor in the hospitality that we offer our foreigners. And so this is one of those places that the structure is already there, and we can participate in what God is doing in Oakland and throughout the world, right? It's that same kind of here, so that they can go back home.
And it's one of the ministries that the church here supports.
And it is a ministry that the church here supports, and it's and also we provide a meal one time a year. And you can go and help serve the meal and eat with the international students. That was in March, I believe. But also on holidays, we have an opportunity to invite people into our houses. Because, the campus is going to close down for Christmas or Thanksgiving or even Easter. And we have an opportunity to invite people to our houses. So there are multiple ways of being involved with
One of the
PRISM.
best is the friendship partner, where you will be assigned one or two people, and you just befriend them. Like maybe, we've taken one of our guys to a high school basketball.
Yeah.
Anything.
Yeah, an opportunity to experience the culture, but also
They love
to...
it. They love to be with family.
Right. And you gotta figure, they're probably lonely. They've
But
left a
I
lot
say
of their
this for
support
women
systems at home.
and men who are all alone need to make a tremendous, because we knew a nurse in Afghanistan who, can I tell the story? He went to Texas with a group of Afghans, and the first night they were taken to a strip joint, and he was horrified, and he was going to get on the next plane, but then he was introduced to this lady who invited him into his home. She was an older lady living alone, and she befriended him, and he calls her his mother to this day, and he became a Christian. He went to church with her. She just had him over all the time. They had a wonderful friendship.
Yeah.
just
there's-
because she befriended him.
That is a wonderful plug, Marty.
It-
Thank
it
you.
is.
But
It's a
that's the
really good
connection.
question,
Yeah.
because when PRISM comes up, I kind of panic about the language barrier and the heavy
These guys
accents.
talk well.
Do they really?
Yeah,
I mean, some
and
speak
some
better than
speak
others,
yeah, but many of them speak really well,
Okay.
really well.
There's a pretty stiff language requirement to get in,
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
and that's been increased in the last year or two.
They have to work or study in English in the graduate level.
Okay.
Sometimes
They're
their
pretty
families,
good.
if they bring
Okay.
their families with them, they don't always
Yeah.
have the same command, but they're there and they can
Okay.
help translate.
Is PRISM undergraduates and graduate students?
Oh, yes,
I think
and
it's predominantly graduate.
predominantly graduate. Most of these are visiting